It's my pleasure to introduce James Hunter, who is the Programme Director for DevOps at IBM. James, welcome.
Thank you, Desmond.
How are you today? Have you enjoyed the show?
Yeah, it's been wonderful. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, busy,
Yeah.
but it's been great to actually see people face to face. It's the first time in a long time.
Yes, and of course the tech community, despite being very large, must be very close-knit as well. Would you agree?
Very much so. Yeah, and that's why this is so important. It's the collaboration which is key, and the conversations that we can have are very different when it's face to face compared to all the virtual stuff. So that's been really valuable today. Really good.
Excellent. Now, you take care of DevOps at IBM. Some people may not wholly understand what DevOps is. I think it's relatively young in terms of sort of the range of disciplines out there in tech. Would you like to explain really clearly and sort of build from there?
Certainly. So DevOps relates to the whole evolution of software and delivering of software solutions, but also running software solutions and what happens when things go wrong in its simplest form. That means that we are connecting all parts of the life cycle, from requirements management to development and testing, all the way through to the runtime of that software, monitoring it, fixing problems automatically, and feeding things back into the development life cycle. So that whole solution can be delivered and updated as fast as possible, and most importantly, at low risk as possible as well.
Right, so that must include an incredible amount of talent and expertise working together. What size would the team be, the collaborative team that you'd work with generally? It must include a huge amount of talent and expertise.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because it's very broad. We talk about the maturity of DevOps as well. A lot of organizations that are just starting, so maybe one or two people, will perhaps have a development environment and won't necessarily implement a full approach to DevOps because it's just a very small team delivering a small project. But as that grows and they get more projects, then they typically need some sort of automation to manage all the changes and all the code and everything that's going along through that larger team. And then once you start getting teams and partners involved, you end up with a lot of data that can be utilized, and then that now needs to be analyzed for optimization as well. So the size of the team varies, typically on the level of aligns with the maturity that those teams have to adopt and utilize DevOps practices. There's a suggestion that an 8-person team is a very good size of team. But DevOps is more than the actual implementation team. It involves business stakeholders, developers, end users, experts in industry, as well as operations and people like that as well. So the size can vary significantly, but it does have a very interesting push on the type of skills that an individual and a team needs to have these days to support an effective DevOps approach.
And it sounds like a company really needs to function well as a family, a collaborative family, in order to achieve these great sort of DevOps outcomes, because everyone will have a slightly different function, be coming from a slightly different background. Can you think of any illustrations or instances where DevOps has been particularly beneficial to a company that's perhaps smaller and one that's perhaps larger?
Yeah, I think family is a really good word, and that's how it should be. It's disparate conversations and collaborations that happen, but everyone's moving in the same direction. So from examples, we have, I've been working with organizations of all sizes and projects of all sizes, from tens of thousands of people down to single number teams as well that are just starting. In some areas of innovation, like fintech, for example, where we have small teams who want to work really, really fast to try something out, test something, and prove something, yet that still needs to be done in a way that can be audited and tested and delivered, because it will need to expand very quickly if it's successful. So those teams are generally very small teams that need the foundation of a DevOps platform so they can catch that information. And a term we sometimes use is a DevOps data lake. This is where we start feeding in data from all these different parts and roles as well. But then when you look at the larger team, should something become successful, the principles remain the same. As you say, the family gets larger. Things don't change. We still want to interact and we have more people around the table at Christmas or whatever. So things don't change in the way things get done. We apply the same principles, irrespective of the size of the team. But what really varies is the level of maturity in the adoption of the tools, from using products to using automations, the team gets bigger, to using things like artificial intelligence and managing that stream of value through their delivery.
That's amazing. And you must have worked with IBM in different countries and different territories. How have you worked with different sort of cultural expectations or different cultures of using technology?
Yeah, so culture is a word that we use a lot when we're talking about DevOps, because we're trying to change the culture of way people work in organizations. For many years, it was very what we refer to as waterfall, where one group did one thing and then handed over to another group, and another group did that. But of course, by the time you get to the end, if something's wrong and they have to go all the way back to the beginning, it's a massive, massive change. So when we talk about culture from our perspective, we're very much in the behavioural aspect of how to do software development and delivery. And those principles are uniform across different countries. In South America, for example, the regulations are different, for example, in the financial and government and public sector perspective, but the principles of reducing risk and maximising speed are exactly the same as they are in, for example, in the UK, where we have slightly different regulations in Europe and elsewhere as well. So there hasn't been particularly cultural differences based on where people come from, but establishing cultural conformity, if that's the right word, about how to deliver is actually a really nice way of ensuring we have a common approach to culture, irrespective of geography.
It sounds like shared values might be achieved then in very different places, which is interesting, by using the similar sort of processes. Yeah. Great, and of course the outputs are going to be very different as well, depending on the sector that you're working in. I wonder if you could share some interesting outputs that you've encountered.
Yes, so when it comes to an industry by industry perspective, the key difference are the regulations. And how that gets how you produce the audit reports to satisfy regulatory requirements, and that determines a lot on how formalised you want those processes to be. So that does have an influence on how much, how many gates, for example, you put against quality and testing and things like that, and where that data resides. There are also different rules in different regions about personal data and how data is stored and where it can be stored. And which location that data has to be. So that needs to be taken into account as well. So those become some of the complications about how do you actually implement an approach to DevOps. How do you establish this culture that we were talking about earlier, and then apply things like automation and AI to make that real. And that does vary because it's sometimes influenced by the regulatory rules that determine whether you have to have where data is stored and the process you need to go through to get verification.
And thinking about influence and cultural influence, we were talking earlier with an expert about coding and bias and how sometimes cultural bias can be encoded. How do you approach that? How do you think about it as a company? How is that possible?
Yeah, it's a really, really important question, I think, and a very difficult one to answer, of course. We're all aware of unconscious bias and things like that. But when it comes to technology, particularly in the space of artificial intelligence, we refer to this maturity model from code to automation to a platform to adding in AI. That can help us. It's not necessarily the complete answer to it, but it helps by looking for unconscious bias from within code itself, but also against the product of the software development as well. So that helps shine a light on where bias may be taking place, and it allows us and the team to learn from that and try and improve and change approaches and behaviour, and even the formation of who's within the team as well, because that's very important to mitigate the risk of having bias within any data set or software code or solution that gets produced.
That's fascinating. And are there any pet projects that you'd particularly like to share that you thought you were really winning with as a team?
There are lots of projects going on at the moment, and we've got a nice variety of projects. We've worked with wildlife projects where we are using IoT devices to understand how animals react to things, but then trying to learn from that as well. We up to very large organisations that are just looking to mitigate risk or modernise applications, and that's very interesting. It's very interesting from a technology perspective as well. Modernisation of legacy applications, systems that were built 10, 20, 30 years ago, often where people have left, but the code is still running and is an important integral part of the way an organisation runs. Trying to understand that and the implication of making those changes and implementing a more modern solution without causing disruption from a technologist perspective, that's a challenge, and we enjoy that from a science perspective as well as the impact on humans as well. But what we do try to do, and I think this is fair across industry, but certainly from IBM's perspective, is learn from all of these projects and think about what the impact we can have, not just on the business perspective, but on the social side and environmental side as well. For example, looking at how we can minimize the impact on the environment of applications that are running. That means if we're introducing more code, if it's running more cycles, it's going to use more power. That might well be necessary. But if there are ways to reduce that code set, to reduce the amount of power that's being used, we all win from that. and applying that on a large scale across multiple projects, across multiple countries, begins to make a difference. So every project that we do, whether it's with animals or business or anywhere in between, we always try to learn from, not just to improve processes, but to optimize we can have a benefit on society and the environment as well.
Amazing. And James, before the advent of DevOps, how did you get into technology?
Me.
You personally?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yes. So I've always had a background in software development and delivery, and DevOps is part of the evolution of software development and delivery. From back in the 2000s, there was a thing called UML that was introduced, which was a way to document the architecture of software applications in a way that could be captured for future people who are taking over the project, or to communicate with all the different teams that were required to build a solution. And that was really some structural thinking about how do we collaborate around software development. So from there, we moved into, as an industry, we moved into things like automation for point particular areas and coding. And then from there, we moved into thinking, well, it's not just development, we've got to get operations, and hence DevOps started coming around at that point. Me personally, I work as a software architect. That's where I started from, designing large-scale distributed solutions as a software architect, and then linking into the coding and the development. And now we move into the automation. I like to help organizations take that same journey and optimize their delivery of software.
And of course, it's at exhibitions that this shared learning happens, isn't it? Having that dialogue. And in terms of where you're all reaching in the future, where do you see DevOps developing more in the next few years?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it is always, it's an evolution that just continues. So right now we're in this stage of, interesting stage of maturity, where there are lots of organizations still at the early stage of just looking at automation. And there are some saying, now I've got this data lake, what do I do with it? The term of value stream management is being used at the moment. So how do we understand that flow of value through this entire team or families we were talking about earlier on? At IBM, we've got a product called Velocity that helps to act as that data lake and pulls in data from all sorts of, not just IBM, but all across the board, but makes that data and the connections between the data visible. And that's what's being used to help influence, determine where we're going next in the industry as well. That sort of understanding the relationship between the data. So now we have a data lake, we're applying machine learning and artificial intelligence. And that really is the cutting edge of where we are at the moment. And I think that will remain the case for certainly for the next few years, as a lot of organizations are still looking to evolve the maturity of adopting DevOps up to a state where they have a DevOps lake and can apply artificial intelligence. Because that frees up humans to be able to think about other things, about the implications of what they want to do. So that's kind of the cutting edge of where we are now, and I think that will be for the next 4 or 5 years, will be the adoption of that, rolling out of that. Long term, we talk about quantum computing, and that's going to change things quite considerably. But I think we're quite some way from realising that yet.
It's very exciting, and of course there are many exciting conversations going on in the room at the moment. Are there any talking points that have really sparked your interest during the conference that you'd like to explore more?
Yeah, there's a couple of things that have come up from a few people, which I think were really interesting. One was about quality. That's come up a few times, because people's definition of quality varies, and it's not just about testing how an application works, for example. It's the back end, it's the integrations, it's the performance, the combination of that, the impact on networks, but also security as well. And embedding that and ensuring that assessment of quality can start as early as possible. But that really does take a cultural change to accept the fact that we are doing that level of testing very, very early on, which might mean we need different skill sets. You were referring about talent earlier on. So we've got to think differently about the talent that's required to implement this sort of change. The other one is actually AI bias, again, you brought up a little bit earlier, and about how do we assess and report from an audit perspective on the decisions that are taken by artificial intelligence. So we can use those for regulatory purposes, but also understand and learn and improve as we go forward. So I think that consideration of bias and audit around AI decisions is really interesting. And I think that evolution of establishing, enabling quality throughout the entire life cycle, and how we do that, and the cultural change that goes with that, are two really interesting points that we'll use going forward, I'm sure.
Excellent. Well, James, you've certainly opened my mind about the potential of DevOps, and hopefully, I'm sure this will be interesting to our viewers and listeners. Thank you very much indeed for joining me today. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.